Imagine being invited to a lavish feast at the estate of a noble lord in the Middle Ages. Thoughts immediately turn to chivalrous knights, beautiful ladies, gallant manners, and opulence everywhere. Prepare to be greatly astonished. Why would you refuse to beautify yourself before the feast? And why could a trip there cost you your life? What shocks you about the luxurious castle? Why were spoons carried to the rich feast, while stale bread was on the tables instead of golden plates? A peacock mummy and roasted basilisk, what shocks you about the menu? And why were whale excrement added to the food? How to drink wine infused with chicken broth? Why would you definitely refuse to visit a real feast at a medieval castle? So, meet our heroine Yolanda. 2 years ago, she was married off. She left behind the cheerful courtly life and now lived in her husband's castle, far from the court, friends, and Bard Elf, a knight in love with her. Life in her husband's castle was pure boredom. The elderly baron spent all his time hunting, while she engaged in needlework and reading. Day in and day out. How would you entertain yourself in the Middle Ages? Share in the comments. Back then, there was no internet, no news, gossip, or fashion trends. You couldn't chat in social networks. And any random traveler at the castle gate, let alone a minstrel or a knight, was a real joy. Hosts eagerly listened to his stories, the latest news, and then discussed them for years. So, it's difficult to describe what Yolanda felt when she received an invitation to a wedding feast at one of the wealthiest families in the country to her distant relatives. No important event in the Middle Ages was complete without feasts, whether it was a successful hunt or the birth of an heir. At the feast, she would see her relatives, friends, and maybe even Bard Elf. Yolanda called the maids and rushed to beautify herself. First, she ordered to make her forehead even higher. For this, the maids applied a mixture of lime and arsenic to her hair. Such a deadly mixture indeed removed hair. Yolanda looked at herself in the mirror and exclaimed, "Oh, life in a rural castle has completely ruined my beauty." Vulgar freckles adorned her face, and even, to her horror, she had a blush and tan. She ordered the maids to apply a lead-based whitening paste and also shave her eyebrows and eyelashes. It was considered very beautiful. A few drops of belladonna were added to her eyes to finally strike everyone with an extraordinarily expressive look. These drops dilated the pupils, giving the eyes a special sparkle. Yolanda didn't know that a constant overdose could lead to blindness, madness, and sometimes death. After some thought, she settled on a green dress. It was also dangerous. To achieve a beautiful green shade, arsenic was added to the dye. Both textile workers, seamstresses, and fashionistas were poisoned. That's the brief, albeit dazzling, medieval beauty. I think since then, the world hasn't changed much. Even today, girls sometimes make great and unjustified sacrifices. Don't you think so? Finally, Yolanda and the Baron gathered. Today, you joyfully pack your bags in anticipation of a vacation. In the Middle Ages, any travel was a dubious, lengthy, and extremely unpleasant pleasure. The first carriages appeared in the 15th century, but they were a very expensive pleasure accessible only to the top of the nobility. The carriage was strapped with belts to a curved frame. This, of course, softened the jolts of the wheels, but they swayed wildly and could overturn on turns. Moreover, such carriages attracted increased attention from bandits. Bandits could turn the journey into a deadly one. The roads were simply teeming with gangs, often consisting of soldiers who wanted to get something when there were no battles. Traveling alone was suicide. It was necessary to find reliable companions and guards. Our heroes set off accompanied by a group of servants. Finally, they arrived at the castle. According to the ceremony, the Lord himself greets our heroes at the entrance to his domain. He assists the Baron in dismounting and our Baroness in exiting the carriage. He ordered the servants to take the guests' weapons and look after their horses. To the sound of the horn, the guests proceeded to the hall where the feast was taking place. If romantic pictures flash before your eyes, remove the veil and take a closer look. They ascend a stone staircase and through small corridors inhabited by bats, with rats scurrying underfoot. For me, it's a real hell on earth. In the large ceremonial hall where the host always holds feasts, semi-darkness reigns. The windows, carved into thick walls, were tiny and additionally sealed with bull bladders against the wind. Glass, which at that time was not very transparent, was incredibly expensive, and only kings and dukes could afford to glaze windows. To preserve precious warmth in winter, they were also covered with shutters, and torches and fireplaces became the only source of light. Over the winter, the castle was saturated with smoke, soot, making it hard to breathe. It was dark, gloomy, and perpetually cold even in the castle bedrooms located above the hall. The feast for the hosts was a matter of utmost importance. It was crucial not to embarrass oneself in front of the guests. Sometimes, hosting a feast could cost a fortune. There was such a variety of dishes that in some cities, they were even legislatively restricted. Like in Florence in 1330, where regulations limited the number of courses to 20 per feast. How could one avoid bankruptcy after such extravagance, considering the number of diners? Usually, preparations for the feast began a week in advance. Although there were more spontaneous feasts in history, which had to take place the next day. Of course, the most luxurious feasts were held by kings. One of the first chefs in history, Guillaume Tirel, described in detail all the features of French cuisine of the 14th century in the famous treatise Le Viandier. He was the head chef of the first king of France, Philip IV, and left a lot of information about how kings feasted. In 1330, the King of France had 75 chefs, 33 wine pourers, and 21 bread bearers. At the feasts of the Burgundian dukes in the 15th century, around 300 guests gathered. They only stayed for 2 to 3 days. Now imagine how much they consumed, considering that 30 people, which is 10 times fewer, consumed in 3 days, 40 pigs, 4 calves, 80 chickens, 10 goats, about 25 heads of cheese, 210 pies and biscuits, almost 2,000 pastries, and 450 liters of wine. Bread and water not included. And now multiply all this by 10. Well, Yolanda enters the hall with a fluttering heart. She sees many familiar faces, her friends, courtiers, but cannot yet spot Bard Elf. Finally, a trumpet sounds from the tallest tower, indicating that all the guests have gathered and the feast begins. Yolanda tries not to show her sadness as she takes her seat. Guests were seated according to their nobility. In principle, such seating is relevant even today. To prevent guests from quarreling. If before your imagination there appears a picture of a gallant feast, refined conversations, and noble manners, then I must disappoint you. Contrary to the common opinion about the terrible manners of medieval knights, everything was not so bad, but far from good from the perspective of modern standards. No, hands were certainly washed before eating, as they often ate with their hands. But individual tableware was a problem. Food for 2 people was served on 1 plate, and this was all during a time when there were many deadly contagious diseases, and there were no vaccines at all. Forks were not used then, they were considered the devil's tridents. Each guest brought their own spoon and knife. There weren't enough individual items for all the guests. Not everyone could afford to eat from plates either. Plates in medieval times were made of stale bread, which was either eaten with what was placed on it or given to commoners. Wiping hands on the tablecloth was generally not prohibited. However, it was necessary to wash them beforehand. The requirements for good manners have not changed much since then, except for one interesting point. It was not proper for ladies at the feast to demonstrate their hearty appetite to everyone. Women were obliged to eat sparingly, much less than men, to remain airy-fairies. Today, on the contrary, a woman with a healthy appetite is more appreciated. Another charming feature of feasts at that time was the perpetual fear of being poisoned. Poisons were a very popular and easily accessible means to solve all family or state problems. Neither royal persons nor clergymen hesitated to resort to the help of poisons. The fear of being poisoned haunted everyone in the Middle Ages. Therefore, all dishes and wines served to high-ranking persons at feasts were always tasted. However, there was a super remedy. A unicorn horn was mandatory hung to each cup, which supposedly turned black upon contact with poison. But since unicorns were not available to everyone afraid of poison, they hung narwhal or walrus tusks instead. And now get ready. While you eat, a crowd of hungry commoners will eagerly watch and salivate over your food. The thing is, for some reason, feast hosts believed that those who couldn't feast would be glad just to watch. Therefore, in the banquet hall, places were always allocated for common people who, although they couldn't taste all these masterpieces, could watch others eat them. Well, and at the same time, watch performances, listen to minstrels, and if lucky, get leftovers from the noble table. However, such generosity of the Lord sometimes led to no good. So, during the feast in honor of the coronation of King Charles VI's beloved spouse, Isabella of Bavaria, the tired spectators rushed to the tables so much that the guards couldn't stop them. Commoners overturned one of the tables, noble ladies screamed in horror, and the queen herself felt unwell. In general, all this chaos was barely stopped. But that's not all. The feast in honor of the coronation of Henry VI as King of France didn't go well at all. Hungry commoners simply rushed to the tables, pushing noble ladies aside and sending their knights away, taking their seats and eagerly eating everything they saw. In the confusion, pickpockets skillfully roamed around. The event was ruined. Would you like to attend such a joyful event? I'd be very interested to know. Well, let's get back to our heroine. The feast in the castle palace always followed a strict ritual. First, appetizers were served, then they were replaced by soups. But this is not at all what you might have thought. In the Middle Ages, soups were not the modern first course, but rather any boiled or stewed dish and sauce. And by the way, the word soup did not mean liquid at all, but rather pieces of bread with which it was soaked. Hence the fact that soups were unusually diverse. Medieval sources refer to soups as stewed pork, chicken with spices, and a thick almond sauce. The seasonings for these soups included almonds, ginger, and even sugared almonds. Of course, there was plenty of game at the feast. But aristocrats weren't surprised by deer or boars. As for exotic dishes, crunchy rodents and even hedgehogs were popular at medieval feasts, the meat of which, as believed, helped with sore throats and skin diseases. Hedgehogs were stuffed with spices and baked in pastry. Which of these dishes would you dare to try? One of the oldest known cookbooks from the 14th century contains a recipe for sweet porridge with almond milk, wheat, and dolphin. Also highly valued in culinary arts was a certain gray amber. This is what whale excrement was called in the Middle Ages. They added it to almost anything. King Charles II of England was particularly fond of scrambled eggs with this very amber, meaning whale excrement. Now, the culmination of our feast arrives. It's the roast served on golden and silver dishes. It's not so much food anymore as it is a show. The most magnificent roast is the bird, swan, pheasant, or peacock. Medieval cooks managed to prepare the bird in such a way that it seemed alive. They carefully removed the skin with feathers from them, roasted them on a spit, and then managed to stretch them back, spreading the feathers, and served them to the table. Solemn oaths were even given over such birds, like at the famous pheasant feast of Duke Philip of Burgundy. Then, over the roasted pheasant, the feasting guests swore to go on a crusade and finally drive the infidels out of Constantinople. But the most interesting thing is that such a beautiful dish was inedible. Peacock, in particular, had a disgusting taste, which has been acknowledged since ancient times. And there weren't many willing to try such a masterpiece. Therefore, having prepared such a peacock once, some chefs quietly served it from feast to feast until it turned into a mummy. However, the famous chef Chicard of the Savoyard dukes managed to stretch peacock skin onto a goose, delighting all the gathered gourmets who finally tasted the beautiful dish. But even lifelike peacocks and golden boar's heads are nothing compared to the real king of the feast, a dish called cockantrus. This mythical monster was considered magical, a relative of the basilisk. Supposedly, brave chefs managed to find and defeat it for the sake of the feast guests. It looked truly unusual, and there were plenty of volunteers to try it. After all, then you could tell about it until old age. But in reality, it was a creature sewn together from half of the most ordinary rooster and piglet. Of course, the stitches were camouflaged, and all this magnificence was painted with dyes and looked fantastic. Our heroine shuddered. At the other end of the hall, she finally saw him. There were 300 guests at the feast, and it was easy to miss each other. He saw her too, and now he couldn't take his eyes off her. But then the fanfare sounded, all the guests gasped. A chicken in knight's armor was brought into the banquet hall, riding on a pig. When everyone at the feast had eaten so much that they couldn't get up from the table, the servants brought beautiful fragrant pies. Our heroine's neighbor couldn't resist and wanted to cut himself a piece. But the pie had a secret. Frogs jumped out of it, and blackbirds flew out. Laughter filled the hall. A living pie at feasts was a favorite joke. But was it a joke or a mockery of the guests? Of course, all this time, they also drank a lot. In addition to wine, ale, mead, and cider, there were drinks like god ale and posset. Wine or beer was mixed with milk and spices. Eggs were also added to posset. But all this is nothing compared to the next drink. A mixture of wine, beer, and chicken broth. I'll quote the recipe. Take 8 gallons of ale, a rooster, and boil it well. Then take 4 pounds of pitted raisins, 2 or 3 nutmegs, and add 2 quarts of the best aged white wine to them. Leave it for 6 or 7 days, then pour it into bottles. And after a month, you can drink it. After all this magnificence, the question arises. What about the toilet? It is rude to greet someone who is urinating or defecating, wrote the philosopher Erasmus of Rotterdam in 1530. In other words, it's okay to relieve oneself in public, but not to greet others while doing so. In the Middle Ages, bodily functions were not considered secretive or shameful, but rather entirely ordinary. People truly answered nature's call wherever necessary. However, in noble castles, there were toilets, special protruding houses with a hole in the floor called garderobes. Yes, you heard that right. They were called wardrobes because the smell of waste killed insects. Hooks for clothes were hammered into the stone walls of the toilet to get rid of fleas and moths. Toilets were either connected to a channel or a cesspit. A horrific incident occurred in 1183. At Emperor Frederick's feast in Erfurt, the floor collapsed, and all the guests unexpectedly fell from a height of 12 meters into feces. Below the banquet hall was a cesspit that wasn't particularly cleaned. The vapors from it eroded the wooden floor. 1 bishop, 8 princes, and about 100 noble knights drowned in the castle's cesspit. The host himself, Emperor Frederick, miraculously didn't suffocate in the excrement. Clutching a piece of broken window, he hung for 2 hours until he was rescued. How do you feel hearing about this dreadful incident? It literally takes my breath away. Now, during our feast's intermission, guests were entertained by troubadours, jugglers, and musicians. Our heroine finally met Bard Elf in the dance. She learned all the news from him. He was still gallant, clever, and handsome. But then dessert was announced. For dessert, they could serve sugared roses or violets, but that's not surprising. What amazed me more was the medieval dessert made of eggs, milk, and bacon. Chefs created real masterpieces out of sugar, dough, and marzipan. For example, at the feast of Duke Philip III of Burgundy, all the guests were amazed by the dessert in the form of an exact replica of his estates. A sweet model of cities and villages with figures of aristocrats, peasants, and even animals and birds. All of this was made from colored sweet dough. And that very Guillaume Tyrrell, the chef of 3 kings, in his cookbook describes how to make Saint Margaret emerging from the belly of a dragon. Against the backdrop of such magnificence, what do you think was the most luxurious dish? Ice cream. It was served only to crowned individuals or the highest aristocrats. True medieval chic also meant renting a pineapple. Yes, in the Middle Ages, pineapples were a rarity. Exotic fruits were very expensive, but pineapples were considered the most unusual and prestigious. They weren't eaten but rather flaunted to impress others. But since buying your own pineapple was very expensive, they were simply rented out for banquets. Our feast came to an end. Yolanda, with a heavy heart, was about to leave the castle. Will she ever see the one who made her heart beat faster? It's unknown. Before leaving, she received a poem from him in which he praised her beauty. How it contrasted with the rough nature of her elderly husband. Times were harsh, but there was always room for romantic relationships in them. If you enjoyed the story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to leave comments. See you in the new videos.